Okay, today I'll be analyzing a Stars 300 buy-in for Stoxpoker.com, and let's begin. Now, the first thing to note is that we are using an overlay, and here are the stats we're going to use. I'll begin with the first one, number of hands. So obviously we start off not knowing anything about these guys. And the second one is VPIP, which stands for voluntarily put in pot percent. And it's a measure of tightness and looseness. So the higher it is, the more often your opponent is voluntarily putting money to see a flop. And the lower it is, the tighter the guy plays. The third number is pre-flop raise percentage. So the higher it is, the more often he's raising before the flop, and it's a measure of pre-flop aggression. And the last one is called post-flop aggression factor, and it's going to measure how often the guy bets or raises as opposed to calls after the flop. And that's another measure of aggression. So I would say the most important ones for the tight aggressive, loose passive type categorizations you should be going for are the VPIP and the PFR. So obviously 3 hands is not a lot to base things on, but as we go on, it's going to become more and more significant. So we're going to look during this sit and go at the action of the character we're following and everyone else, and see what some good plays are, the bad plays, and particularly when we get to high blinds. Now, what's interesting about the sit and go, as we've discussed, is that low blind play, you really want to play tight because, and I'm saying this relative to a no-limit cash game, when other players are eliminated, you automatically gain equity. Okay, and I'm going to pause it for some of the key hands we'll be looking at. So in this one, we have a decent hand in the button. It's folded to us, and we're going to make a small open raise. And we take it right before the flop. During lower buy-in sit and goes, this is a tougher move to pull off. But as the play tightens and you have a lot more push bot type guys who are playing a more mechanical style and don't want to get involved in pots early, if you have a decent hand and it's folded to you on the button, you can often come in for a small raise, and 10 queen would be about the minimum I would need to make that raise. So that's pretty solid there. And anytime a player gets eliminated, you automatically gain equity. And that's because there's one fewer player who can finish in the money. And as a result, you really need a solid reason to get involved in a low blind pot, a big pot during low blind play. So that is really what we want to do. We want to avoid low blind situations unless they're manifestly positive for us. And during mid blind play, we're going to get involved in a few more hands to stay ahead of the blinds, and then do a mainly shove fold game late when the blinds get high and effective stacks dwindle to 10 blinds or fewer, where we're mainly in push-fold mode. So, we continue with the game, and we don't know too many of these players. The guy 3 to our left is the screen name for Umberto Brenes, so we'll see whether he uses a pretty standard multi-table strategy or how he adapts. Should be interesting. One thing you'll notice that he completes now, I completed earlier with kind of a junk hand of 2-6 offsuit. And the reason for that is when you're getting 5 or 6 to 1 early on, it's very hard to turn down. Okay, you're risking just about no chips to see a free flop. If you unexpectedly hit good, you have the potential to stack an opponent. And it's really a pot odds thing. So particularly if a few guys have already called, you should complete pretty wide. And if it's folded to you, completing is often a good idea when the blinds are still low, because you're getting 3 to 1 and you can hit a flop. And if not, it's pretty easy to just make a small post-flop bet of half to 2/3 of the pot, and if that doesn't take it right there and you don't improve, you just get out. Okay, Lacan makes a raise, folded to Toby Wong, who re-raises. And let's see how this hand plays out. We like to try to get insight as early as possible into how our opponents are playing, because we combine that with these manual reads with the stats, and that gives us very strong reads. Okay, so Toby Wong has just called a very large bet, and now he's checking again on the river, And at this point, we have to put Luck Cat on an ace. It's pretty unlikely he's going to be bluffing the situation. And Toby Wong is pretty hard to put on a hand right now. So we'll see what they show down with. Okay, and indeed, Toby Wong was still playing his set of aces. And Luck Cat was also still playing a set of threes. So it's a fairly inevitable result. And the only thing that I would really say is that Toby Wong took a big risk checking the river. It ended up working out very well for him, of course, but a lot of the time the guy is just going to check behind. Even if Luck Cat had a decent ace like Ace Jack, Toby Wong's big willingness to play a big pot could easily have scared away Luck Cat, and therefore it's a much higher percentage move to go ahead and bet out yourself for value at a river like that with such a monster hand. Luck Cat, meanwhile, bet relentlessly for value, so he cannot be faulted for that. Okay, so Captain Cruz, we see after 9 hands, he has a very high VPIP of over 50%. And again, 9 hands is not a very statistically relevant sample, but any information is better than no information, so it's something to go on, and it's what I call in the book the tentative read. And in other words, if you have an idea of how you think a guy's going to play, then you tend to notice a lot better when he makes a play that confirms or denies that read. So it gives you something to look at, and it makes the new information you get stick in your head a lot better. So even if you think that something you've picked up on isn't very significant, keep it in the back of your mind, and then you'll be a lot more likely to see in the future whether the reads you pick up confirm or go against that. Okay, Deuce 5 is a clear check. And obviously, I mean, even a cash game you wouldn't want to bluff out at a pot like this, and certainly in a sit and go with 4 other players. Be suicide. And again, even though we don't have a lot of info, Kozel, this is the first pot he's entering, and we're going to complete here. Okay, this is a pot odds complete. And even though, okay, we're only investing 15 chips, so it's a weak hand, but we're getting very good odds. And usually the big blind won't raise in a situation like that without a pretty decent hand. And what do we make of this? Well, this is the first pot Kozel has entered, and he seems very content to play it aggressively. So he's got to have picked up some aspect of it. And meanwhile, Lure 1 is content to play passively. And it'd be very nice if we could get Kozel to show down. But alas, so maybe he had a hand like Ace King of Diamonds. And right now we're using the Poker Office Replayer, and it doesn't really matter what tracking software you use as long as you use it. It's an excellent investment. So Poker Tracker, Poker Spy, get tracking software. It'll definitely pay off. And okay, we're down to 7-handed play. So the blinds are ready at 25.50. 2 guys already eliminated. And during 25.50, a good strategy is to make late position blind steals when you have a decent hand and good position. And otherwise, there's no reason to get involved. Okay, there's no need to force a play. So for instance, this should be folded. Okay, a small raise is fine to 125, but you wouldn't want to play a big pot. Okay, he checks. We make a standard continuation bet of about half the pot that takes it. That's a slightly marginal blind steal. Certainly anything weaker than King 10 suited, we would want to fold. And basically, when you do come in for these blind steals, you don't want to play big pots. So for instance, this is probably with Aramir an unnecessarily large blind steal of 5 big blinds. Because when you make a blind steal, there are 2 components. One, you can win immediately, which is always nice, unless you have aces or kings or something. And the other reason is you can play after the flop, and usually you have position, and this, say you raise from the cutoff and the bunting calls you. And with position, you have a great advantage after the flop, so you can either win immediately before the flop, and again, Aramir is making an overbet blind steal. unnecessary just to take down the blinds. And when you have a good chance to win before the flop, and you have position, and you're the pre-flop aggressor, you have good chances after the flop. Okay, now Toby Wong comes in for a 150 raise steal, and with King Queen suited, we would normally call that raise. Probably not re-raise, since he's been not coming in a lot. But after he was re-raised again before the flop, we can't stay in. And lure 1 with such a small re-raise, a lot of the time a guy will show down with a very strong hand in the higher buy-ins, or any buy-in is a pretty suspicious raise. Okay, here we definitely want to complete. We're getting 3 to 1 with a suited ace, and the effective stacks are too high to make a good steal. You could make a raise to around 175, 200. We're just going to complete, consistent with our kind of small ball strategy. Now, betting out that flop would have been fine. We didn't hit it though. If he had checked behind on the flop, we would have bet 100% of turns. If your opponent checks behind on the flop, then no matter what you have, you've got to bet out on the turn. Okay, so now we have a limper. We have kings. We make a standard raise to 200 for our blinds. And it's fine if he calls. We position with a monster. And just taking down the 125 on the table is also fine. Okay, one thing we've noticed now is that Metaman has played 0 out of 22 hands, so we're expecting him to be very tight. And in this hand, okay, let's go back here. We have lure 1, and did he limp or did he raise? Okay, he just limps, so this would be what I would classify as a high blind limper. So I would put in a note here and tentatively mark him as HBL, or high blind limper, for a guy who's willing to limp during high blinds and then not defend that limp. And Umberto B made a nice over-the-top play, and he collected 250 chips, a healthy fraction of his chip stack, without a fight. So that's good. He's attacking passivity, and he was out of position during the hand if he had gone to the flop. Now, this is kind of an unusual overbet with a hand like 9s, 10s, or jacks, maybe ace queen. You'd occasionally do this. Usually with over 10 blinds, you're not looking to play push fold poker. Unfortunately, we don't get to see what he had, but typically you'd be looking to raise more like 250, 300 in a situation like that. Okay, so here 250 with ace queen, pretty standard. And if one of these guys had come over the top big, we would have had a tough decision to make. We would be getting decent pot odds with a pretty solid hand. Probably would have to call, but pretty fortunately, I'd say we usually just want to take a hand like that down before the flop. Okay, min raising is something that you usually don't want to do. Very small raises are fine, but guys tend to be a lot more blind defensive when you min raise them. You know, they seem more explicitly they're getting the odds, and it's also kind of an ego thing. They don't want to let their blind be taken away with just a min raise. So he had pocket queens, and that's a pretty strong hand. But even so, you want to have position with queens. You don't want overcards to flop. So I would discourage action with those queens by raising to at least 250 or 300, and even a larger raise of around 400 would be very defensible. Okay. Captain Cruz takes it down with a continuation bet after the flop. And Aramir is looking to make a big play because he has under 10 blinds. So that's a pretty reasonable play to make with most mid pocket pairs, 2 strong high cards. Okay, a hand like Jack 4 offsuit, you definitely want to make a blind steal, even if Lure 1 had folded. And note that Lure 1, this is the second time that the player has made a high blind limp. So it's very rare that you want to limp from late position during high blinds. And This is the second time we've seen him do that. So if we had made an initial note that was tentative, now we would eliminate the question mark and say, hey, this guy is pretty definitively an HBL. Okay, 7-9 suited. If it had been open folded to us on the button, a steal raise to around 375 would have worked out. But as is, we definitely can't play. Now Umberto B comes all in, and because this guy only had under 500 left or so after his raise, Umberto better have some kind of value in his hand to make this sort of play. Otherwise, he's made a pretty big mistake. He'd probably want at least ace-10 or pocket eights. In fact, he more than has that with his pocket kings. And the river makes him a straight, so his hand holds up. Okay, the tight playing Kozal raises the 3 blinds under the gun. It's going to indicate pretty strong strength. We talk a lot in Sngman101 strategy about trying to distinguish between raises that are primarily for steal purposes and value purposes. And Kozal's 450 under the gun raise would definitely be a steal raise. You wouldn't want to go over that without a very solid hand. And Madaman has still not played a single hand with voluntarily putting money into the pot, so we're pretty convinced he's tight. Okay, interesting hand here. Captain Cruz is limping, and what does that mean? Well, hopefully we're going to find out. Seeing HBL, is he trapping? Because so we don't find out. When a tight aggressive or good regular limps early on during high blinds, you got to ask yourself, why is he doing this? And a lot of the time, he'll have aces or kings and he's trapping. Okay, this is an interesting hand. Now, if Kozal had folded, then the pot would have been 650 plus 75 is 725. It would have cost us 350 to call. We would have been getting better than 2-to-1 odds, and therefore we would make a crying call there, due purely to pot odds. Because unless this guy has an overpair, we would figure to be better than 2-to-1. And indeed, we would have been the favorite, but not counting on that. You always have to look. Never. It's always a big mistake to just quickly fold even a hand that looks like it's pretty weak, because sometimes you're getting the pot odds unexpectedly. Okay, here's some guys who would call and try to trap, but pocket tens don't hold up well after the flop. This guy isn't a super aggressive pre-flop player, so we should definitely just shove this. Indeed, we do. And winning before the flop isn't a problem. Okay, so you definitely don't want to get involved early in a lot of hands, but stats like these, this is way too nittish. You really have to get involved in. I mean, it could be 100% card dead, but pretty much it's very likely that he's just playing too tight. Maybe he doesn't feel comfortable with the 300 buy-in, but those are very rockish stats. Okay, so ace-king suited. We make a blind stealing raise, and for value we would definitely call if somebody came over top of us, and anywhere from around 350 to 450 is fine. But I don't like the all-in there. The all-in works, but your hand is so strong, want to give somebody else a chance to re-shove on top of you, and otherwise just taking the blinds is fine. Okay, this is another pretty. Umberto B is correct to want to leverage his large stack, but he's risking a substantial amount to do that. So again, unless he has a hand that doesn't play very well after the flop, I would probably not make that play with many hands. You know, maybe pocket nines or tens, ace queen, but usually you want smaller raises. So my typical raise size here that I like would be around 375, 350, 400. 450 is fine, but a lot of the time it's more than you need just to take down the blinds. Okay, and now Madaman makes his first move, and again, he could have had a hand. It's hard to say. He hasn't shown down a single hand, but it seems likely that his strategy is going to be to late position steal when he does enter a pot. The second pot, enters on the button. So his strategy is to get to late blinds and then go into shove fold mode, which isn't so bad, although he does overdo it a little. Okay, ace-9 offsuit is a definite shove here. You can look in a program like Wizard to see what hands you should be shoving, but pretty much I would say any hand about ace-6 would be around the weakest ace you'd want to shove, pretty much any suited ace, and with 8 blinds, ace-9 more than qualifies. And we're of course happy to pick up the blinds though, because we're not going to be a huge favorite to many hands that call us. 7 queen certainly too weak. And if we had to begin classifying these players, we would say that beginning here, Toby Wong is a fairly tight player, not super aggressive. Kozel's playing a pretty standard tight aggressive strategy. Madaman is playing an extremely tight strategy. Captain Cruz is loose and not particularly tight, aggressive or passive. And Umberto B's stats aren't standing out too much one way or the other at this point, although we have seen him overbet a fair amount. Okay, King 10. Okay, now Madaman pushes, and we've seen him loosen up a fair amount in late position with his steel hands. Really, the pot odds, okay, we have a pot of 1,500, it costs us 1,100 to call, and we're told that we're getting just under 3-2 on the call. Now, it really depends on what range we assign this guy for a shove. So, for instance, if he's shoving, he's actually correct to be shoving close to 100% of hands based on what he has to imagine our calling range is. He knows we're not going to be calling particularly wide, and for instance, any hand worse than King 10 we probably wouldn't even consider. King 10 is very borderline. Let's see what we do here. I think a fold is probably a slightly... This is a slightly loose call. I mean, he's opened up a fair amount from late position. Okay, and it turns out that he's entirely on a bluff. And our call was a little loose. His play, though, was good. It looks ridiculous. You know, a guy shows down 10 deuce offsuit and he gets called, and it looks absurd. But the bottom line is that if we're calling with, say, the top 25%, which is pretty reasonable, then he's correct to shove any 2 with around 6 blinds and chips. So his play was actually fine there. I think his only real mistake was playing so extremely tight early, kind of overdoing that tightness. And our strategy now, since we are actually just barely the chip leader, is we want to play more pots and be aggressive. Okay, let's look back at this hand. And I believe in this one Captain Cruz limps, yes. Okay, so now we have to wonder if he's a high blind limper, and he folds to an all-in by Kozel. Strong play by Kozel. He sees there are 500 chips on the table. That's nearly a third of his stack. He makes an aggressive all-in. We don't know what his hand is, but that can't be a huge mistake. Okay, we get a walk with ace-king suited. But Captain Cruz, we would now tentatively mark him as a high blind limper. And that's fairly consistent with his loose and somewhat passive strategy up until this point. And right now we're going to want to be coming in for a lot of small raises, particularly once the antes kick in. Okay, so we'd probably make a small raise there if Toby Wong hadn't opened the pot. And Toby looks to be pretty selectively aggressive. He's not playing too many hands, so we're going to give him some respect. Okay. And this is fairly typical tight aggressive late blind play. So we'll wait until we have a more interesting hand. Okay. Now here we have another very interesting hand. Captain Cruz limps again. So now we're definitely thinking he's a high blind limper, and that is one of the key notes to take in these games. Guys who are really aggressive high blinds, which I call HBA as an abbreviation, and high blind limper, the HBL. And this 200 limp looks very suspicious. Now the only problem here is that they're playing very deep. These guys are playing about 15 blinds deep. So Umberto is very correct to want to take advantage of this passivity but he's risking a lot of chips to do it. So even if he has a decent hand, I think normally I would make a raise to around 500 or 600, or even 700 to isolate this guy and either take it after the flop or win immediately. I don't really like the risk-reward ratio here, but it's in the right spirit, certainly, of attacking passivity. And for Kozel to overcall this hand, to call before we even see what Captain does, he's definitely going to have a real monster, a real solid hand, and we get to see what Umberto B will show down with. So, always good to be able to see what guys will show down with. Okay, now I don't really like either of these plays, because Umberto B, when he does get called here, he's going to be a pretty significant dog, usually a 70-30 underdog to a better ace or a pocket pair of 8s or aboves, and that's a pretty marginal play. Again, I think a raise to 600 or 700 would have been better there to either take it before the flop or isolate Cruz. And Kozel has a very strong hand, so if Umberto B had limped behind or made a small raise to maybe 500 and he had fold equity, I like that. As is, that's too many chips to be calling off with the king high. So I think that's fairly weak playing on Kozel's part. Now we fit the bubble, and the ante kicks in. And guys tend not to adjust very well to the ante. And in particular, the starting pot now is going to be 400. And if you make a raise, a pretty small raise, guys will tend to call and come back over the top of you pretty similarly than without the ante, even though there are now 100 dead chips on the table. And that's an empirical observation. I say that based on watching and playing a number of games, that sit and go players tend not to adjust super well to the ante, whereas for good multi-table players, they adjust very well to the ante, because the ante is a much more significant part of multi-table tournament play. Okay. Now, Umberto B could arguably have come over the top with any two cards there because he's chip leader on the bubble. He's going to be looking to play a hyper-aggressive strategy. And meanwhile, we're looking to play pretty aggressively ourselves. Captain Cruz yet again high blind limps, so he's a confirmed high blind limper. And Umberto B is now taking our advice. He's not just shoving, but he's making an isolation raise. And a bit of a high one, but still think that's a better play. Captain Cruz indeed will not defend his 200 chip limp. So that's pretty passive playing, pretty weak playing. Okay. Now you really only have one move here. You've got to raise all in, and the reason for that is because you're out of position and you don't want to take a lot of risks during the bubble. So we definitely want to shove this hand. And we see that Umberto B is willing to fold even to a pretty significant steal raise. And it's very rare that you want to be raising to 800 in a situation like this as a blind steal. It's way more than necessary because a guy who's folding to 800 is usually going to be folding to a much smaller raise of around 500 or 600 as well. So a raise that I like here a lot is 450, 500. Even 600 is kind of pushing it in terms of when you need to take the blinds. Okay. So it continues, and now Umberto B makes a very strong re-raise. This play I like quite a bit, because if Captain Cruz calls, then he's not risking all of his chips. He voluntarily shows he had a good hand. And it's a very strong re-raise. And he's taking advantage of bubble passivity, bubble risk aversion, because nobody wants to get bubbled out. Okay, that's absolutely key. Nobody wants to get bubbled out. So you need to exploit that fact ruthlessly with bubble aggression. Okay, this looks like an obvious fold, but we need to have a pot odds verification. We're getting 3-2, just under 3-2 on the call. So we would need to be getting at least 2-1 to consider calling this, so we fold. But you always want to verify these, because sometimes you get pretty counterintuitive results. For instance, that 5-9 hand earlier, a lot of guys would have just immediately discarded that, as we did, but if it hadn't been called before us, we would have played it. Umberto B is continuing with his solid aggression, which is good, but betting, over betting a lot of his hands, which is fairly exploitable. Because when you have a solid hand for value, you can come over top. And okay, that's a pretty weak fold on Hero's part. 8 king suited is definitely good enough to come in for a small raise. It's a little awkward because Cruz could come over top of us, but in general I think a raise to 450 or 500 is pretty solid there. Not a huge mistake. And Umberto B most likely is checking rather than just shoving after that limp, because he shoved a couple of the previous limps and maybe he's a bit wary that he's being trapped. But after the flop, he senses weakness after that check and he attacks it, which is good. Okay. And now Cruz raises all in, Umberto B calls. Umberto B, of course, has no fold equity, so he better have some value for this to be a reasonable call. And in particular, what do we expect him to show down with? It's always good to estimate. Well, I would say ace 8 or better and a pocket pair 7s or better would be about the minimum he would want to make this play. And indeed, ace 8, that's about the minimum he'd want. So Cruz luckily doubles up through him. Luckily for him, not for us. And I would say any worse than Umberto B would not have made that play. Here we would have restolen against a guy like Cruz, perhaps. But Umberto B would call us too wide with his very large stack. He could call without getting crippled. And now we get down to about to get down to 200, 400. Okay, this is an interesting hand here. Toby Wong is going to be shoving fairly wide here. He's about to get blinded out, which he does not want to do. If the blinds pass him again, he's going to have about 800 chips. He's going to be losing his strong fold equity. He's going to be shoving pretty wide here. So the starting pot is 400. He raises all in for 1200. Now the pot's 1600. And it costs us about another 1,000 to call. So we're getting about 3-2. And with King Queen suited, that's strong enough that we figure to be nicely ahead. And if not, we're not crippled. So I like this call. I think it's a good call. With a hand like King Jack offsuit, we wouldn't call. And his 5-jack suited is pretty marginal. The jack is going to be dominated a fair percent of the time when he is called. But you know he's about to get blinded out. So even though it's kind of a loose shove, it's certainly not abysmal. And now, unfortunately, we are the short stack. And the blinds, I believe, have gone up to 2-4, yes. So, what happens if we fold this hand? If we fold this hand and the blinds pass us, we are going to have under 1,300. And with under 1,300, we have just about 0 fold equity. Because if we come in with an all-in steal, the most we can raise is about 3 blinds, and guys are going to be calling us very widely when we're only raising 3 blinds. Therefore, we need to be raising very aggressively here, and in particular, I'm going to be raising any hand that is not absolute trash, and that's because otherwise we lose our stealing fold equity. Okay, so for Jack, this is a raise designed to look like it could be for value, and this shove is probably, almost certainly, not going to be plus equity in a vacuum when considered by itself, but the alternative is to get blinded out, and since we don't want that, and we do have a face card, we come in aggressively, and it works out for us. So again, the reason we make that play is because the worst thing that can happen to you in a sit and go is to lose your blind stealing fold equity. So don't let that happen at all costs. And now we are, again, needing to make a move. Okay, ace check. We make that re-raise. We presume when we make that re-raise that we don't have any re-steal fold equity. Okay, because the reason for that here is that Captain Cruz has pot committed himself with his bet to 1,200, or at least so it would seem, because he's getting the odds to call with just about any 2. So the reason that we're going to come back over top of him is for value. Okay, we are the short stack on the bubble, and therefore we need to make a play at some time, because otherwise we're going to get blinded out. And ace-jack is strong enough that we're forced to make what we think is going to be a call for all of our chips. And amazingly, for another 1400, getting excellent odds, Captain Cruz folds. So that's great for us. But for value alone, that's a hand we need to pursue. Okay, if it's folded to us, we're going to be shoving with any 2. And it's not. Umberto B. Okay, he's correct to shove very wide because he's the chip leader at the bubble. But since we have effective stacks of around 10 blinds, he shouldn't be shoving literally any 2. So a hand like, Jack 2 would be too weak. You'd probably want something like, a reasonable king or a pocket pair. So we get to see what he shoves with. And that'll be interesting to see. Okay, ace-jack suited obviously more than qualifies. Cruz again sucks out on him. And the bubble continues. Okay, if it's folded to us, we're going to be looking to shove almost any 2. Okay, 3-5 suited would be debatable, but that would probably be a shove because these guys are going to be calling fairly narrow. As it is, we don't have to make a decision. And guys are tightening up their calls, as they should be, because we have 4 reasonably even stacks in the bubble. And we're just going to be looking to play a hyper-aggressive game here. Okay, Queen 7 suited. That looks a little bit weak to be. From the button, we would play it at. Under the gun, that's too weak. It's not going to be a plus equity hand. And hopefully we'll get a chance to either have some value or to make a... Okay, so this hand we clearly have to re-steal. And Umberto B should just be shoving. Unless he has an absolutely premium hand, he has under 10 big blinds. So he wants to be playing raise, shove, or fold poker. And any hand that he's willing to commit 1,200 chips to, he should be willing to shove. And we come back all over top of him for a value. Okay, suited ace queen obviously in four-handed play figures to be a pretty solid winner. And we're seeing that both Captain Cruz and Umberto are willing to make laydowns once they're pot committed. So a re-steal fold equity, in other words, the value we get from re-stealing just based on a guy folding without us having to show down, is pretty high with these guys. And that's good. That's good. We get to widen our re-steal range. Hands that we come over top of a previous raiser. And we're really looking in great position now. We have a nice chip lead. And we're going to, if this guy folds, we'll shove pretty much any 2. And we've seen that Toby Wong is willing to shove pretty wide under the gun. Captain Cruz is going to need a hand here. And I'm guessing that Toby Wong was probably going to make this play with just about any ace, any pocket pair, any decent king, most 2 Broadway cards. Captain Cruz, by contrast, probably needs a real hand here. And the great thing about a showdown is we get to find out. So let's see if it's in fact correct. And, okay, so Cruz did indeed have a real hand, ace-jack. And Toby Wong, I think, would have made that play with lesser hands than ace-9. But with ace-9, he was certainly correct to make that shove. And they actually split it with a pair of 7s, queen, king, and ace kicker. And that's not so bad for us because we can still exploit bubble risk aversion. And let's see what we folded in that hand, because we want to be shoving pretty wide. Yeah, for king under the gun, any hand we're called with is going to have us dominate a large percent of the time. And from the button, I would push it anyway. Under the gun, unless these guys are calling uber tightly, we're going to want to fold that. Umberto B makes an any 2 card shove. Very solid. And we're still looking good. Wanting to regress very widely. Okay, ace 4. Okay, this is a tough situation here. Toby Wong has shown that he realizes that he needs to shove widely at 200, 400, and particularly from the small blind. So our ace is probably going to be ahead of his range, and we're getting laid 3-2. So from a chip perspective, we're looking pretty good. The problem if we call, though, we're losing 2,000 chips. So if we were one of these other guys where it would cripple us to make the call, this would be a fold. As is, because we have a positive chip expectation and we figure to be ahead of his range, we're getting late odds, and we get to appear blind defensive. Calling is reasonable. Folding will not be a big mistake. But this isn't such a bad call, and Toby Wong, I think, is going to be making this play with just a pretty big majority of hands, maybe top 65% of hands, laying down hands with no potential. Okay, indeed he is. Oh, so he flopped a straight, like out there. He was correct to shove with 4-5, because he's probably going to assume that we're not calling particularly wide. So that was a good move on his part to shove with a 4-5, and we had bad luck there. Ace-Jack is an obvious shove. And one theme we've been seeing is that when you have effective stacks of 10 blinds or fewer and you're the small blind during bubble play, you want to shove just about any 2 cards. And we'll see that with Wizard. Okay. This hand, Eat Queen, this is very marginal. I'd say anything worse, we probably wouldn't want to shove. But it's good enough, particularly considering that guys have correctly begun to tighten pretty heavily. And we're not going to get called without a fairly decent hand by one of these guys. So good, we take the blinds. And they're probably about to rise to 3-6. Yeah, they're rising now to 3-6 with a 50 ante. And we have effective stacks now. Our stack size is 6 blinds, so we can let the blinds hit us again, and we'll still have about 2,600, enough to steal the blinds. But with any kind of a decent hand, we're going to look to raise all in here. And, okay, what do we fold? Deuce 9. So if we had even slightly a stronger hand, such as Jack 2 suited, we'd probably shove there. Just not total junk. Captain Cruz is correct to shove with just about any 2 there. And the orbit can pass us, we'll be okay. But after the blinds pass us this time, we absolutely have to make a move before they pass us again. Otherwise we lose our strong fold equity. Okay, this looks like an obvious fold, but we need to check the pot odds. We're getting just better than 3-2. Unfortunately, it's very unlikely we're going to be anything besides a 2-1 underdog to 2 overcards, so we do have to fold, but always verify those decisions. Sometimes the results will surprise you, and you have to make a crying call. Okay, if it's folded to us, we're going to shove any 2 against Captain Cruz. And pretty standard. Okay, guys are correctly steal raising whenever they get the chance, so we have 4 guys who pretty much know what they're doing. It's folded to us again. We'll shove pretty much any 2. Toby Wong is definitely a high blind aggressive player. Okay, and now we get to see what he shows down with. So he's raised under the gun for all his chips. We expect that he's going to be doing that fairly wide, maybe the top 50 or 60% of hands. Umberto B to call, though, is going to need some kind of a hand. We've hypothesized that before, and it's come true, so Umberto B, I'm definitely guessing as a hand. Oh, he certainly does. He's king suited. And Toby Wong, weak king. Pretty debatable shove on his part, but better to be too aggressive than too passive. And Umberto B gets the right hand at the right time. Okay, here we're not looking to be quite as aggressive because Toby Wong is certainly not going to lay it down for another 40. So I'd say this is a fold. Good. And Umberto B is getting 3-1 odds on an all-in call, so he correctly does it. And it doesn't matter what the flop is. I don't know if he's checking just to be kind of goofy. But for another 40 chips, okay, he's correct to call with literally any 2, obviously. And a jack high takes it. But even with 4-9 off, with getting 3-1 odds, he's correct to put Toby Wong all in. And now we're looking not quite as good again. And with king 10, okay, this is a definite call. We're getting close to 3-1. We have a well above average hand. and we unhesitatingly make this call. We figure to be ahead of his range, we're getting good odds, and with a short stack, otherwise with a short stack anyway. Oh, and again he hits us straight, but once again we got our money in good. And now we have to reevaluate our strategy. At this point, we have the minuscule stack, which I defined as under 2 blinds and chips. And our strategy now is we're looking to call an all-in, because that way we triple up, have the potential to triple up against a single opponent. And if everyone folds to us, we'll go all in because we're pot committed. But there's no way, particularly with the ante-money as well, that we're going to leave this hand, regardless of the prior action and regardless of what we're dealt. The only exception would be if, say, Umberto B raised all in and Toby Wong called and we were dealt trash. Pretty much, though, we're playing any 2 now. Okay, this is really good, actually, because we have a pretty solid hand for 4-way play. And Umberto B's bet to us is effectively the remainder of our stack, which is over 1,000. So he's betting 1,000, and we have an extra 6, 3, and 2, an extra 1,100 on the table. So there's about 2,100, and it costs us 700 to call. We're getting 3-to-1 odds, and yet this figures to be roughly even with Umberto's shoving range here, which is going to be pretty wide. So this is really a pretty solid call. And we're going to be right back in it if we win, and if not, well, we made a good play. And indeed, Umberto B, with 1 overcard and 1 undercard, is only a slight favorite to our 2 middle cards with some suitedness and connectedness potential. Unfortunately, that's not good enough, and we bubble out. But the key thing here is that we played it well, and there's nothing you can do when you play well and you bubble out. Just don't go on tilt. And I think it was overall very well played. A couple of errors maybe, but let's look at those in fact. And now we're going to pull up Sit and Go Wizard and have a look here. And the question is, we looked at Sit and Go Wizard on our first video, and I've already pulled up the game, and it's going to look through all of the hands it thinks you made a mistake on, and we'll look at these explicitly. So, hand number 1. Okay, now, the first hand that it says we made a mistake on, this is the debatable call where this very tight and yet late game aggressive guy shoved on us. Now, it's saying that he opened with the top 25%, and do we agree with that? Well, it looks maybe slightly tight, okay? I think France mid-suited kings he would shove with, maybe up to king 8, so slightly looser, but not dramatically so. Okay, that looks about right to me. And this has some calling with mid-kings, shoving mid-kings. And in that case, it would still be a fold. Okay, using our 10-man 100, we're losing about $2 with a call here because we look at it as percentage of a prize pool and a 10-man $100 buy-in, as we discussed in our first video. So this was probably slightly too loose a call, not dramatically so though. So we would say that with effective stacks of around 6.5 blinds, we would need to be tightening our calling range in the big blind just a little. So you always want to learn something from these hands. The next one, it says, is this okay? So this Jack 4 offhand is one that I discussed earlier. Again, it's definitively Wizard is very much correct. It's minus equity for this particular hand to shove here. However, if we don't shove, we get blinded out and lose our stealing fold equity, and that in that situation our equity plummets. So this is a desperation shove that we retain our stealing fold equity, and that's why we made it. But it is true that in that, looking at it in isolation, we're not winning money. Okay, it's only when you look at the game as a whole that becomes a profitable strategy. Okay, the next hand was when we called Toby Wong's all-in. We discussed that hand in pretty good detail when it actually occurred, but we figured to be ahead of his range, which was indeed much wider than 25%. And it was perhaps more like top 50%, if not wider. It turned out that he had 4-5, so it was much wider. We didn't know it was quite that wide, though. And in that situation, even with 50%, which I think is definitely, based on what we'd seen, he'd be shoving at least 50%, would be correct to call with any ace, so ace 4 qualifies, and we just the best luck there. So you always have to adjust the defaults the wizard gives based on the observations you've made on the players in the hand. Okay, and in this hand, we raised with queen 8 off. We made an all-in. Captain Cruz, I believe, might be slightly tighter than this in his call. I think you'd probably want, because he's got a reasonable stack, some kind of, I would say any suited ace would be about the bottom, so 18% is about correct. Umberto B with a slightly higher stack, I think he's also probably about 17 or 18. And that comes out to being a marginal fold, and I don't know, these guys may actually be a little tighter, but at the same time, this is probably a slightly too loose push. So we note that with effective stacks of around 6 or 7 blinds, we want a little better than queen 8 off to be shoving from the button. So that's good. We want to learn from our games so we can optimize our late game decisions in future games. And the last hand was the very final hand. Okay. Now, this one is very crucial because it's suggesting that Umberto B is going to be opening with only the top 16% of hands. And based on what we've seen of his aggression and the hands he's been showing down with, there's no way he's that tight. So one could argue he's going to be raising with top 75% of hands. Let's say it's top, 45%. That top 40% to be conservative. He's raising extremely wide here. And in that case, it's still saying it's a very debatable fold. If we do fold here, note that we're essentially blinded out, and particularly considering he could have been shoving a little more wide, I still stand behind this call. And with a total junk hand, you might consider folding, but with a minuscule stack, you really don't have much choice. The alternative is to hope that one of these guys busts out in the next couple of hands, and I prefer a much more proactive approach. And that is going to conclude this video of a Stars 300 for Stoxpoker.com. Hope you guys enjoyed, and signing off.